Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Michael Grenke. He is a professor at St. John's College with a BA from the University of Chicago and PhD in political science and government from Boston College. He has published numerous commentaries and translations on Nietzsche and is a preeminent expert on that thinker. And he wrote the introduction to the book we're going to talk about today, Warspeak, Nietzsche's Victory Over Nihilism, authored by Lise van Boxel. So, Dr. Grenke, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you.
So, let's start perhaps with a definition. So, what is nihilism, generally speaking, and also as Nietzsche understood it?
Well, okay, so generally speaking, I think the term nihilism is often associated with a belief that there's no truth or that there's no good and bad, no moral meaning, or generally that there's no meaning in life. But I think it might be better to think of it in a more fundamental way as having the ultimate or underlying determinant of the will to be nothingness. That is making your way of living, and I'll use a kind of Nietzschean expression for that, that making the letting out or expression of your strength to consist primarily in negation. Now, Nietzsche himself understood nihilism, I think, in quite a variety of ways, but with respect to the book we're talking about right now, with Lise van Boxel's Warspeak, which is a kind of close reading of Nietzsche's On the Genealogy of Morals.
Yeah.
In that book, especially, Nietzsche identifies nihilism, what he calls nihilism today. He thinks of it as a concept that, like every concept, has undergone changes over time and therefore needs a kind of historical presentation. And the iteration of nihilism in Nietzsche's contemporary world, and probably still our world, as he would understand it, is the following. It means becoming weary of the human being. And I think Lise van Boxel in her book kind of glosses this as a disbelief in any genuine human future, and in the thought that anything that human beings can do in this world for themselves would be a worthwhile endeavor anymore.
Mm-hmm. So, in Nietzsche's understanding, we've always had nihilism, and then, more recently, historically speaking, in the 19th century, when he lived, nihilism had evolved or was evolving to a different kind of thing than it traditionally was, or how did he think about it exactly?
Yeah, I wouldn't probably say that he would say we've always had nihilism, in the sense that it's emergent and probably has maybe even a number of different origins, probably just because it comes from a number of different people and the way they experience the world. But I think in the contemporary end of the 19th century that Nietzsche is facing, nihilism was becoming more self-conscious and more open in its expression, even to the point, I suppose, of there being some people who were consciously avowed destroyers of things, who wished to just break the world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And he differentiated in his work between active and passive nihilism, right? That's an important distinction in Nietzsche.
Well, I don't know how important it is, so let me just put it this way. I think those terms aren't used in the description of nihilism and on the Genealogy of Morals, and I think for the most part in Nietzsche's published work, there's little, if any, I can't think of a use of it. I would say it is used in some of his notes on the will to power. So I'll try to talk about what this might mean. Active nihilism, well, maybe start with passive nihilism, since in a way it's the more prevalent form. seemed in his notes, like in the Will to Power, the note that's labeled 22, I think, it uses this phrase. And I should say maybe about the Will to Power, just to be very careful. We probably shouldn't regard it as a book, since it was sort of not put together with a kind of unified authorial intent. Nietzsche never wrote such a book, and it was sort of put together by his sister and an editor she hired to try to compose it. It wasn't composed according to any plan that Nietzsche had. He had plans for such a work, but they weren't followed exactly in the composition of this book. And the parts that compose the work that we call the Will to Power these days weren't all exactly written by Nietzsche. I would say many of them have been meddled with by an editor in fairly serious ways. So there are notes that have been spliced together from different parts of his notebooks, and there are notes like this note that discusses active and passive nihilism that has been cut away from a fuller note. And so I think what we're seeing here are very interesting things, and many of which are worth thinking about, but not exactly a book written by Nietzsche, not exactly thoughts that Nietzsche expressed in the form that they have in that book. But I think the thought there, at least, seems to be that there's a kind of passive nihilism that belongs to those human beings who think there's nothing good to do with themselves or the world anymore, and they've given up in despair of any fulfilling or project that they could be involved in, so that they accept the judgment that nihilism as a belief really represents, that there's really nothing in the world for them. There's nothing for them in their lives, or any human being. The active nihilism that he refers to is, I think, more thought of as a transitional phase, that a certain pessimistic and skeptical way of looking at the world, carried out thoroughly and to its final conclusion, undermines existing previous claims about meaning, about truth, about morality, but that is just the beginning. That's where I think the active nihilism takes that as a beginning that doesn't end in despair, but ends in, or begins on this basis to understand the absence of these things, to give permission to make many new projects and to try to make new things, to replace or supplant what one maybe could consider to have lost. So I think that's the way active nihilism distinguishes itself from passive nihilism. That active nihilism is just a kind of intellectual moment and on the way toward new creation, new positing, new experiments, especially because I think in the absence of the limits of old claims about what can and can't be done, or what should and shouldn't be done, there's a vast openness for human beings to try out new things.
Mm-hmm. But I mean, I think we can certainly think about different manifestations of nihilism, like, for example, existential nihilism, moral nihilism, epistemic nihilism. I mean, life has no meaning, there are no moral values, there is no truth out there to be discovered, something like that. Do you think that Nietzsche was worried about all of these, or could it have been the case that he agreed with at least some of these, like, for example, moral nihilism?
Well, I think, let's say, though Nietzsche's got a book that has a famous title that seems to imply going beyond morality, beyond good and evil, I think the actual meaning of that title is more restricted. Good and evil is only one kind of morality, and I think as he says actually in a note at the end of the first essay of the genealogy, a kind of note and aside to try to give a hint as to how to read the title of Beyond Good and Evil, he says it doesn't mean beyond good and bad. I don't think Nietzsche thinks we ever exactly get outside of morality, because he ultimately thinks all living beings make demands on the world, they just in terms of their own living assertions, and that those demands constitute a kind of baseline moral claim. And we never get outside of that or stand outside of that. On the other hand, that might not mean that those claims are well-founded in the way that thinking conscious beings demand demonstrative foundations.
Mm-hmm.
So I think Nietzsche is certainly more concerned with moral nihilism than with any other form. But because I think he's more concerned that way because he thinks morality is a more important shaper of our lives. In fact, even things like our approach to knowledge, so the epistemic morality, I think Nietzsche thinks are often just reflections of the morality that really dominates our aims and intentions.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, since we're focusing here mostly, I mean, in Warspeak on Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals, could you tell us what is the main thesis of that book?
Yeah, so I think it's, as you might know if you read some Nietzsche, it's not always clear what his books are about.
Yeah, I know.
No, absolutely. And I think, they resist in many ways a very simple and clear distillation that's still faithful to what Nietzsche's really doing. But I'll make this attempt. I think the main thesis maybe is not so exciting in this sense. It's a kind of general claim that morals should be understood as things that change, that come into being and pass away, and as things that exist primarily as some kind of changing or moving, they need to be understood historically. And maybe even in a particular kind of historical way. This is what Nietzsche means by genealogy, because he doesn't accept that many other historians of morals have done an accurate or adequate job. I think particularly because he thinks many other historical approaches haven't fully embraced the becoming character of morality and its concepts. They tend to think of morality as belonging to some realm that's more permanent and absolute than it really is. So in presenting his own version of the genealogy of morals, an account that shows the various transformations and movements in the development of moral concepts, Nietzsche finds that there are what recommend to him at least two main categories or two types of morality. Master morality and slave morality is how he calls them. And master morality is the type that came first. It comes from original and spontaneous self-glorification of essentially conquering races that feel themselves to be on top of another people and also on top of their circumstances, in control of themselves and powerful and good. And they announce to the world a set of values that says that things like us, the way we are, that's what defines what is good. And they have a kind of casual and not very careful designation of things that are other, that are bad. The second kind of morality, slave morality, comes into being in Nietzsche's account as a kind of subterranean or undeclared war against master morality, a war that's primarily going to be carried out in thought and in language, and particularly in control of the conceptual array of human beings by trying to tell them how to think about certain words like good and bad or good and evil, and to try to transform the way in which and bind in the way in which they think about these things. So I think initially Nietzsche presents that as a war conducted by a particular class of nobles, the priestly class, against their noble rivals, a warrior class. But that revolution spreads because it embraces the conquered or the lower classes, the non-noble classes, the oppressed, and tries to engage them as allies in this subterranean and psychological war against the noble human beings, the warrior types. So Nietzsche presents that war as ongoing from probably even prehistory in certain ways, but the most important iteration of that war is represented in Nietzsche's thought as sort of the emergence of Christianity out of the Jewish tradition and being a kind of perpetuation or continuation of the struggle of the priestly types amongst the Jews against those warriors and warlike types, and including their extra-Jewish opponents like the Romans. So that war Nietzsche presents as ongoing for at least 2,400 years and maybe longer. And he presents, I think, slave morality as having tended to predominate or win, but not win decisively or finally. And that these two moral types leave within the human beings that exist today kind of inheritances, well, however one thinks those are inherited. It's a kind of evolutionary story that blends inherited tradition and culture into the notion of human evolution. This predominance of the slave morality is the main concern, I think, of the genealogy of morals. Nietzsche thinks that it is intrinsically nihilistic, the slave morality, but it tends to spread a deeper and more thorough nihilism, even to those for whom the kinds of judgments that belong to nihilistic beliefs don't really fit. That is, it subverts those who would have positive or affirmative ideas. That's part of the psychological warfare. So Nietzsche's main concern here, I think, is that this moral war is tending in a direction toward a more and more final victory for the slave morality, and that is tending toward a human disaster, maybe not the end of human life, but the permanent diminishment of human life.
Mm-hmm. So why did they call it polemic?
Oh, so I think in around 1886, Nietzsche gathered up his previous works and he made some small revisions and had the previous works reissued. And he added, one of the additions that he made to all of them, except the Untimely Meditations, was he added a subtitle. So that after 1886, all of Nietzsche's works have subtitles. But on the Genealogy of Morals has the subtitle Ein Streitschrift, which means a polemic, or either fighting writing or a contesting writing. I think it's not a very specific sort of subtitle, but it does characterize the work, right? And I think the meaning of this subtitle, I'll refer to Lise's Warspeak here just to show how she interprets it. She takes this subtitle to be a declaration that we are in a moral war, one that hasn't necessarily been conscious or declared. And that war is, of course, again, in the realm of words and thoughts and writing. And this particular writing of Nietzsche is announcing itself as being a combatant in that war. And as Nietzsche's book is not a bystander. So what he's doing here should be understood as operating in a realm of struggle against other combatants, particularly his ascetic and nihilistic opponents. And I think the one thing I really want to say about that is it's not initially clear on whose side Nietzsche's Genealogy of Morals is. For instance, it's not so simple to say that Nietzsche prefers master morality to slave morality, because there are many things in the course of the development of human beings over the 2,400 or so years that slave morality has tended to win or predominate, that Nietzsche doesn't want to throw away. In fact, maybe I'd say this generally. Nietzsche doesn't want to throw away anything. Though he has things he disapproves of, his attitude towards those is not that he wants them not to exist in any way, but he wants to turn them to some advantage, to turn them into something that is useful or good. And so, for instance, maybe one of the biggest things that develops from the slave morality is that human beings are placed in conditions in which they're asked or demanded to fight against their own instincts, to restrain certain behaviors especially the aggressive behaviors that might belong to these conquering peoples. And in that nexus of restraint comes development of new avenues. That is, the psychic energies or psychic urges that have been prevented from external expression take strange pathways to try to find new ways to express themselves, and included within those strange pathways is the development of some kind of deeper interior experience. And the parts of our own psyche also have much more dynamic and complicated relationships with each other because they haven't been allowed the rather immediate release of external expression. This develops the human mind. Nietzsche practically says human beings only became interesting because of the slave revolt, and we only became deep in our soul or in our mind because of this slave revolt. And he doesn't, and maybe even he also indicates we really developed reason because of this. We developed the kind of clear pathways of demonstrative logic only because we were delayed and prevented from having the immediate responses of action out in the world. So Nietzsche doesn't want to get rid of any of that, but but all of those things, I think, for Nietzsche begin in conditions that one doesn't want to maintain. That is, they begin in frustration, they begin in tearing oneself apart, and which is a kind of decline or decadence, decay. And they begin essentially in positions we wouldn't wish to have, but having had them, we then acquire capacities and new avenues of really human expression that we don't want to throw away. So Nietzsche's trying to find a way to take all those things that belong to the slave condition, the slave morality, and turn them into positive, healthy, life-affirming things that are compatible with a yes-saying attitude toward the world.
Mm-hmm. So you've already told us about master and slave morality and about, I guess, in general terms, how Nietzsche looks at the history of European morality. Is there anything else you'd like to add in terms of how Nietzsche looks at how European morality evolved culturally over time, or is just saying that it's basically slave morality overcoming master morality over time and gaining prominence, and that's the basic summary of it?
Well, I could maybe say a couple of things that make a little more explicit what the master and slave morality are. Okay. And then maybe something about the situation of European morality as we find it. That is, I think Nietzsche understands morality as sort of the main evolutionary shaper of human beings' minds, the main, at least external factor in our development. And the European morality is the inheritance of this evolutionary process within morality itself. So the course of this evolution of morality can be understood, I think, according to Nietzsche, as a product of a massive project of revenge. That is, this is really what the slave revolt in morality amounts to. From an earlier time where one group of people was conquered and oppressed, by another group, the oppressed developed tendencies and allied themselves maybe with a group within the master, the priest. And the oppressed suffered from their condition. I think this is, in a way, one of the biggest factors in trying to understand our psyche for Nietzsche, is to see the ways in which we have parts of ourselves at odds with one another in ways that paralyze us, that dissipate our energies, that leave us sort of trapped in complexes from which we can't extricate ourselves. And one part of the story that Nietzsche tells is basically that in the earlier times, one group of human beings was suppressed rather violently and suddenly by another group of human beings. This is just the story of one group being conquered by another. But the conquered people are denied the ability to do what they want. They're hemmed in by their oppressors, and the consequences psychically are that these people are suddenly forced into a condition to restrain their natural impulses or their habitual impulses, and they can't let them out, and that's when they develop these rich and complex interiors. But it's essentially a traumatic event. And so we have in our history, one could say, a great psychic trauma. And the working out of that trauma is this project of revenge, of the slave morality, an attempt to try to convince the people who feel good about themselves, who are outwardly successful in the world, who are on top of circumstances and maybe feeling well integrated, that their way of being is wrong and that they should restrain themselves and suppress themselves and make themselves more like the subject human beings, the oppressed. And so the European psyche develops in this account out of the clash between this rather simple and not very reflective noble morality that approves of itself, that looks honestly at itself and its own condition, finds it good, says yes to it, and is rather callous and uninquiring regarding the condition of others. And a morality promulgated by the oppressed, who try to subvert that sense of well-being, because their own sense of themselves is that they find their own condition a kind of self-torture. They don't like the way they are. They are full of conflicts because they're full of drives and urges that have been driven inward and that continue to try to do something, and that mainly means something negative to their interior. So this is the great frustration that's built up in these oppressed peoples, which Nietzsche calls ressentiment, and we have a fair amount of it in our lives, I would say, even now. But we also retain something of that previous master or noble morality as well. So we have within our own lives, most of us perhaps are a kind of mixture of these two heritages and have a kind of conflict between these two sides within us. And Nietzsche thinks, I think, that the slave morality is tending to predominate, but it hasn't achieved a final total victory in the human psyche. And it threatens to do so in such a way that, for instance, every bit of our suffering from ourselves would be numbed or dimmed down by various medical treatments or something like this. That would achieve a final victory, I think, for the slave morality. Something that I think Nietzsche thinks no one would really like. I would call it a victory, but no one would win. And Nietzsche thinks what one needs is to try to take what's been produced by this struggle and turn it into something that human beings really could honestly affirm and find good for themselves. So to take it into a positive and affirmative direction. So I think assessing the outcome of this struggle, Nietzsche thinks we have a dangerous but possibly fruitful set of circumstances facing us. And we have a need for a new moral revolution because the continuation of the course of things as they've been going would not be good for human beings.
Mm-hmm. So what is it that in the book Warspeak, Lise van Boxel calls the moral-theological prejudice?
Oh, sure. So Lise is reading something that Nietzsche mentions in the preface to on the Genealogy of Morals, a kind of account of his own early childhood attempts to solve the problem of evil. But in the context of that, Nietzsche indicates that he hadn't yet learned to separate the moral from the theological prejudice. And when he did learn to do that, he really became much more aware of what his true project really was, the thing that he was trying to resolve. So the moral prejudice, as Lise describes it in the book, and I think this is simply right, is the prejudice that takes claims about what's good for one person or for one type of person and universalizes it and assumes that it's good for everyone. So it's the tendency that Nietzsche calls dogmatic, actually, in Beyond Good and Evil, to say that what's good and what's bad for me and my kind is good and bad for all. And it tends to ignore, I mean, the reason one might call it a prejudice, I think, is, first of all, it hasn't, it's predicated on an insufficient investigation into whether and how human beings are significantly different from one another in circumstance or nature. But it also has a kind of, it's a judgment before making an inquiry about whether one's own condition is really and truly universal. So that generalization from one case or one kind of case in moral terms to all cases is what Nietzsche calls the moral prejudice. And I think that's usually the way moral theorists tend to approach things, is to try to give one theory for all. Nietzsche, for instance, looking at the kinds of distinctions of hierarchy that are made in these earlier aristocratic arrangements, sees that they might have one rule for some people and another rule for other people, different kinds, different circumstances. And so I think that's the thing he's looking at when he's calling this moral prejudice a prejudice. The theological prejudice is a thought that what is real and what is admirable and good has to be eternal and absolute. And so it really is the depiction that we often find the world after death, or to be claimed to be in various religious traditions. That is, it's a claim that takes the theological prejudice really is a kind of, one could call it a universalization in time. That is, it endorses what is permanent, what is eternal, what is absolute, free from context. And in this respect, I think Nietzsche thinks it's a prejudice in part because it's not actually part of our experience, these things. Mm-hmm. That is, we experience a world of things that come into being and pass away. These thoughts that the real and the true and the good and beautiful are all and only permanent, perfect, absolute. That's the theological prejudice. And they're often intermingled. In fact, especially the moral generalization gains a lot of authority from claiming a connection to the otherworldly. That is, it reaches to the perfect and the absolute and the eternal as its source, and that gives the moral claims a much greater strength and authority. If you separate the two, then you face the moral tendency to universalize on its own terms and merely human terms. And you confront, I think, the source of morality as coming from human agency, which makes it possible to oppose the claims very easily, especially if one recognizes that contending moral claims also have the same source, human agency, and no higher authority.
Mm-hmm. And what is the ascetic ideal?
Yeah, so the ascetic ideal is related to this theological prejudice we just mentioned, right? The ideal is the other world, the transcendent world, a world of being in its purity, deprived of any sense of becoming. And it's most frequently in our lives represented by the depiction of God as a perfect, eternal, sometimes infinite being. Now, I think as an ideal that has a meaning in human life, or is approached or practiced by human beings. The ascetic ideal means trying to live in such a way to mimic the conditions of this other world, or to approximate the conditions. So it means living in a way to minimize change and susceptibility to change. So often it means, for instance, depriving oneself of any sensory pleasures, because those are passing things, for instance. And it means making life as similar as possible to non-life. Psychically, and consequently epistemically, it often means trying to make oneself as devoid of interest as possible.
Yeah. So, I mean, since Nietzsche in his works tends to focus so much on intra-individual psychological mechanisms like affects and drives, how does he look at how culture influences human psychology? Because in this case, when we're talking about, perhaps we could call it the cultural evolution of European morality. I mean, certainly it seems that culture plays a big role for Nietzsche here, correct?
Oh, yes. How do I say it? In some way, I guess culture is linked to an attempt to take evolution into our own hands, to the extent to which one is consciously shaping the human inheritance and its modification over time. Culture is maybe no less important than anything one might say is inside human beings. I think even the distinction between what is inside us and outside us is not so certain and so pristine. For instance, I think Nietzsche thinks many of our drives and affects are inherited. And maybe this is exactly the way an evolutionary biologist really treats mind. Mind is inherited. Mm-hmm. Not necessarily, our advanced thoughts that we learn in our lifetime, but I think if you combine the notion of traditions being inherited, so that our learning in some ways comes to us as part of a particularized heritage of a certain group of beings breeding together. Nietzsche thinks of, I think, the deep connection between our mind and body, the way in which one might say our mind is something about our body. And so Nietzsche, I think Lise in Warspeak often is using this phrase physiopsychology to try to indicate that mind and body are not to be distinguished in some kind of absolute dualism of kinds. I guess I want to say this, that Nietzsche has great hope that we can affect what kinds of human beings will come into being, and particularly I think he has a hope that a happier, more affirmative, powerful, and less self-torturing human being can come into being. Part of the way to do that is breeding. I'll mention a bit. Of course, it's a touchy subject, but I think Nietzsche regards any polity, any community of human beings as de facto being a breeding project, because it just the community, what the community value, and here's where culture really takes the fore. What the community values as admirable, as valuable, as desirable, affects who breeds with whom and what kind of offspring they produce. And so, in a way, it's a extra genetic factor in determining exactly what kind of species we're becoming. If there are certain things that, for instance, assertiveness or aggressiveness, if we devalue those things, it seems likely to be a consequence that we'll find fewer human beings that have those traits in the future. And so I think Nietzsche is really thinking that the big effect of cultural values is biologically determining regarding the kinds of human beings that will be produced, and consequently the kinds of ways in which they will experience life in this world, whether it will be joyful, whether they will feel well integrated, or whether they will feel that this world is essentially oppression and despair. Mm-hmm. Of course, there are many other, this picture, especially given, I think, modern technology, becomes a much more complex picture in part. But even the deployment of any bit of modern technology, I think Nietzsche believes, and I think this would be correct, will predominantly be determined by our morals. Which technologies we will promote, which technologies we will allow ourselves.
Mm-hmm. So, according to Nietzsche, where does nihilism stem from? I mean, what gives rise to it?
Yeah, so here too, I think I'd probably give a kind of biological answer. I think nihilism stems from extreme and thoroughgoing bad experiences of the world. And those come from the judgments of defeated and defective souls and bodies. That is, nihilism comes from the judgment of human beings who feel that their fundamental experience of this worldly existence is bad, who judge that life is no good. And then I think if you add in something like the practice of the moral prejudice, they generalize or universalize that judgment to think this life is no good. And that leads them often to thoughts of either simple despair or of thoughts of ways in which they can find some small avenues of positive experience for themselves, like teaching themselves and others that there's another world unlike this where we won't suffer this way.
Mm-hmm. But do you think that nihilism is common and widespread in modern society?
Yeah, I guess I would say yes in various ways. I remember, when I was younger, the very famous book, The Closing of the American Mind, that Alan Bloom published. And I knew Alan Bloom when I was an undergraduate, and he was just publishing the book at that time. And of course, there's a lot of attention on that. I think he wanted to entitle that book Souls Without Longing, which wasn't as catchy as The Closing of the American Mind and probably would have ruined the career of the book. But it captured some sense, I think, that there's a kind of aimlessness and despair in many human beings today. I think a way I recently thought about this in talking to a group I was lecturing to was, if you think about how much people experience what they call boredom these days. And by boredom, I would probably say this. I mean something more powerful than maybe what people sometimes mean. A thoroughgoing feeling of dissatisfaction with the current situation without any sense that there's anything that could be changed or anything worth doing.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of, especially, maybe even the upcoming generations feel this way. Maybe a lot of current events make it easier to make the claim that people have little hope for the future. But I think it's especially true. There's things I could mention that I think might have to do with the prevalence of nihilism as Nietzsche saw it and as Lise really illuminates in Warspeak. For instance, in a lot of moral claims that people want to make today, moral claims that have abandoned their foundations often, because many of these morals were founded upon particularly religious traditions. People try to hold on to the morality even after they stop holding on to the God. But in the typical expression of what people think of as what is moral, they will talk about something that they regard as selfless. In fact, even saying that one does something for oneself can rankle the sense that people have of what is moral. So in Nietzsche's approach, this makes no sense in any way. That is, no living being does things with no reference to itself. That is, selflessness is not a positive motive. But this is the predominant notion that prevails over the formulation of moral claims these days, is that to be moral, we must be selfless. I think Nietzsche sees in this, in a way, a really problematic hatred of the self underlying our moral claims. Schopenhauer is a very good example. He wants to deny his own will, deny his own principle of individuation. Another way one might see a prevalence of nihilism today, I think, is in all the otherworldly religions. Now, maybe religion is on the decline. Maybe it will rise again. I don't know about that. But it's still a very prevalent and important part of human culture and the world today. And to the extent to which it aims at another world other than this one as its guide, as its authoritative standard, I think Nietzsche sees in that, again, a rejection of this world, a kind of negation. So in both of these, the morality of selflessness and the otherworldly religions, Nietzsche sees nihilism, really. Maybe not conscious nihilism, but really determining your will by some principle of negation, negating the self in one case, negating this world in the other case. And then I'll just maybe move to, we could say philosophy and science, maybe especially science, what is called science today, as distinguished from philosophy. The model of the scientific approach is the disinterested observer. Mm-hmm. But I think Nietzsche there sees another negation, particularly one is negating the life principle that makes an observer an observer. I think Nietzsche would probably indicate, if we are to reach some kind of positive and affirmative relationship to ourselves and to our world, we have to avoid denying what makes us alive. And one of the things that makes any living being alive is that it's interested in the world, in itself, and in the things that it pursues and avoids. To take that out of our experience and to prioritize the viewpoint from some supposed disinterested being is, I think, by Nietzsche's account, a really perverse way of denying life. So again, I think these are all ways in which I think nihilism is prevalent. There's a kind of really, I think, amusing passage in The Gay Science. It's the first time in his publication that Nietzsche says God is dead. It's section 108 of The Gay Science. But in that passage, Nietzsche compares God to the Buddha. And he says when Buddha died, they still showed his shadow in his cave for hundreds of years. And Nietzsche says we may still be experiencing the shadows of God for thousands more. And I think that's the way in which the story he wants to tell about a moral revolution, especially a subterranean moral revolution, a war that wasn't recognized as a war, really, you can't underestimate how far the influence of this particular ascetic way of looking at the world has gone. Even science, for instance, and politics. I think Nietzsche finds democracy and socialism to be promulgations of this same urge, and he finds, for instance, physics that attempts to express universal claims is still an expression of that moral prejudice, and maybe even connected in a way to the theological prejudice, to the extent to which the physicists express these claims as laws, which imply a lawgiver. So this is just sort of the deep embedded way in which nihilism infuses our life. All of those examples I gave are not very consciously nihilistic. In fact, many of the people who endorse those ways of being would deny nihilism or be upset about it. But I think I guess Nietzsche's trying to point out, they don't understand how much they've been infected.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that we should make a distinction between the way nihilism originated and first spread and what keeps it going nowadays? I mean, is there a distinction there to be made?
Well, yeah, I think very much so. The origin, if it really can be located in this slave revolt, for instance, is in Nietzsche's presentation, it's a project designed to advance a particular political class to ascendancy over its rival. And in that respect, it's not even believed by the people who are promoting it. It's more a weapon they use against others. So that's a very different experience or situation than what we find as the development that have ensued from this slave revolt, 2,400 years later or more. That is, the claims that were made, which probably were disingenuous and not believed. I think even a lot of the analysis of on the genealogy of morals tries to show that the people who promote the slave morality don't really believe in what it says about good and evil, because especially their depictions of the rewards of the afterlife are things like kingship, when Christianity promises that the kingdom of God will be given to those who are meek, for instance. They're promising a reward that the slave morality says is evil, but it's what you get if you are good in this world. That is, if you are meek, if you are unassertive, unaggressive, unsuccessful in this world, you will get not something different from what your oppressors had in this world, but exactly what they had in a more thorough and permanent way. So that initial project was not, I think, a project of sincere believers, one might say. And maybe even deep down, Nietzsche tries to claim, I think Lise's book at a certain point really tries to lay out the way in which the adherents of both master and slave morality, in principle at least, have a consensus about what they really admire, what Lise calls a superabundant vitality. They really do admire strength and success. Now, we as the inheritors of this event really have a different experience. For instance, I think the claims of the slave morality have so shaped our thought and discourse, our experience of ourselves, and have been so internally inherited even in our drives and our affects, that it has become a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. And so that is an account that was at one point just a weapon to be used against people who didn't really experience the world in this negative way, has become an account that does fit us in a much more thoroughgoing way. And the nihilism promoted by this revolution has buried and hidden the fact, I think, that human beings did and still can think and feel another way. So it's almost inconceivable, I think, to many contemporary people. I certainly see this when I talk with students, for instance, that there could be a morality that was selfish. That was, even though there are, I think, many examples in our historical record, in our literature, and even in our philosophy. For instance, even Kant, who I don't think anyone should think of as a very selfish man, presents it as a moral duty to develop our own faculties, not for the sake of anyone else, but for ourselves. And so that's a sort of part of Kant, I think, that people don't really attend to that much. And it isn't the primary moral demand. That is, it's one that can be delayed. So even there, it's weaker in Kant than it could be. This dominance of this morality of the slave type, especially in terms of public discourse, at one point in Beyond Good and Evil, I think Nietzsche presents it as a set of claims that understand themselves to constitute the whole realm of morality. Well, the fact that people can feel differently and have different moral claims that they did in the past and still can, that's one of the things that the account that Nietzsche gives in the Genealogy of Morals is mainly aiming to give us. I mean, to just remind us that people can really approach the world quite differently than we think, and that they themselves were not simply, for instance, benighted or corrupt or something like this. They may very well have been better integrated and happier than we are. So the importance of the master morality that Nietzsche depicts opens up a possibility for us that we might not have thought of, and it invites us to reach for the kind of health and strength that is found in the claims of the master morality that maybe are not so readily available to us under the sway of the ascetic ideal of the slave morality.
Mm-hmm. So what about solutions for nihilism? What kinds of solutions does Nietzsche present in his work, and would it require an individual, a collective effort, or both?
So I think both is an easy answer, although a complicated answer, right? I mean, and I think also an accurate answer. In the Warspeak, for instance, Lise offers this presentation of the third essay of the Genealogy of Morals, which asks, what is the meaning of the ascetic ideal? Nietzsche begins that essay by laying out seven different human types and gives some kind of account, although it's not entirely clear, of what the ascetic ideal means or meant for each of those 7 types. And then he restarts the whole project and goes through each of those types in sequence, and as Lise very carefully charts, he doesn't actually go through all of them, so he leaves some things unsaid or in the dark. But in each of those cases, Nietzsche takes a look at what could be called an anti-life, nihilistic, purely negative approach to things is in the life of different human types like artists or philosophers or scholars, women. And he shows, I think, that in each case, it's not entirely correct to think that what they're doing is negative. In each case, there's some aspect of self or part of the self of each of these people that is being allowed expression within the system of the ascetic ideal, which is essentially negating. For instance, I think even the most clearly ascetic approach, which is that found amongst the holy men, their scourging of themselves is not just a purely negative thing. And it's not really a negative thing. It's some way in which a living thing with limited possibilities, having abandoned the bigger positive projects of life that it might have pursued or might have hoped for because it has taken this nihilistic or ascetic turn, is still finding a way to let out its strength and express itself to live within this realm. So, for instance, the holy men's scourging of themselves, just looks like hurting themselves, is a way for a part of themselves to feel masterful and powerful. And it's when you can't, for instance, make yourself into what you would like. You can't make yourself, for instance, I think in contemporary culture, as nice looking as you might like. Disfigurement of some sort still falls within the realm of something you can control and feel powerful about. So I often think a lot of the body, not all of it, but a lot of the body modification that people do, various tattoos and implants and things like this. A lot of that is not trying to make themselves look in some ideal way better than they, but it's the abandonment of the hope that they could look better. I was thinking in these cases, though I'll admit many tattoos, for instance, might be very nice to look at, or some of the things implanted are very pretty bits of jewelry. For the most part, or for a large part, at least I might say, you see people here doing something similar to the kind of cutting and damaging that psychiatrists would try to put you in the hospital for. That is, people are in compensation, or maybe not compensation, as a kind of substitution for making yourself look better the way you would wish to look, because you don't think that that's realistic or that it can be achieved. You choose instead to feel powerful by damaging the way you look, making yourself look worse, but making yourself look worse deliberately. And I think a lot of self-harm is like this. There's something that feels powerful in damaging anything or in taking anything apart. So a lot of the nihilistic expressions that the ascetic ideal leads people to embrace, Nietzsche analyzes as really the expression of some part that just is taking advantage of the existing situation as it is and whittling it down, exercising some control and power over their own situation in life in the minor way that it's allowed, not in the positive way they would wish, but often in the negative way that still allows them to feel powerful. Just like walking down the street and breaking branches off a tree might feel powerful to a living being. It has a certain kind of gratification of allowing you to let out. But on the other hand, it's not what one wants to do. I mean, in a positive sense.
Mm-hmm. So, just one last question, and out of curiosity, where does the title Warspeak come from? So,
the title comes from that subtitle on the genealogy, the Streitschrift, the polemic. I think it's really in a way, Lise envisaged Warspeak as a loose translation of the subtitle on the Genealogy of Morals. Now, what is meant by this term in Lise's terminology is to think of a book like the genealogy and like Lise's own book, Warspeak, to be written in a certain way, a way of writing and speaking that initiates a counter-war against the slave revolt and its effect in our psyche and in our language. And Warspeak aims to make language more lively, less static, to embrace the characteristics of coming into being and passing away, and trying to, by, for instance, periphrasis or circumlocution and poetry and rhythm, to really give a sense of the movement of moving things that wouldn't otherwise be there in language that really has been sort of rendered fixed and pristine and absolute. Now, I think in the practice of writing Warspeak, Lise intends to change the meaning of many terms. This is part of the war waging, and to make those meanings more compatible with positive, affirmative ways of thinking about the world. It's also supposed to embrace the spirit that one might find in warriors. There's two things that Nietzsche finds in warriors combined that are generally very hard to combine in life, but might really, in some way, describe an important part of the human condition. One is danger, and the other is playfulness or joyfulness, or even, how would I say it, a comedic approach to things. That is, in the spirit of warriors, one often finds them in quite dangerous situations or in proximity to danger, and still quite cheerful, quite lighthearted, And I think Nietzsche is not simply saying we should be lighthearted in war or something like this, but that combination, which one might think doesn't go together with being lighthearted and being in danger, is some model for an affirmative way to be in the world. It's some model that we can look at and try to instantiate in a new way, not in the way the warriors have it, which is a little bit, how would I say it, not so thoughtful. But to embrace, the full powers of our depth, our intellect, our self-reflection, and our vast consideration of the human condition, and still find a way to be playful, sportive, even mocking in the context of a world which maybe doesn't have the kinds of foundational basis that we hoped or that we were wishing for when we're looking to another world that's permanent and eternal. So we feel ourselves less protected, less safe in our efforts, but to still find a way to be enjoying a simple appreciation of our existence.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I will be leaving a link to Lise van Boxel's book, Warspeak, Nietzsche's Victory over Nihilism, in the description box of the interview. Dr. Grenke, would you like to mention where people can find your own work on the internet?
Well, I think you can find some of my translations at Amazon.com, and if you're looking for upcoming works that will be coming out fairly soon, the Political Animal Press will be publishing some things from me very soon.
Okay, so thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show. It's been a pleasure to talk to you.
Oh, a pleasure to talk to you.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. If you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like, hit the subscription button, all of those things you already know. And please consider supporting the show either on PayPal or Patreon. All of the links will be in the description box of the interview, starting at $1 per month, so it would be a great help. This show is brought to you by Enlights, Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters: Karen Litske and Blanchett, Pererga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Craig Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Wiesel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolf, Tim Hollisey, Eric Alenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Rutger Vosbo, Weingard, Rebecca Newberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windager, Rui Narcio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Espinha, Phil Kavanagh, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Eric Neumann, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hugni, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librant, Oslem Bulut, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Lononio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmidis, Aima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litske, Denise Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy and Trader in NYC. My producers Izar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Luis Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardus France, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder. And my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Codreanu, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.